In my continuing series of a Nintendo Fanboy reviews Sega Genesis games, I'm going to be reviewing Earthworm Jim. Of the Genesis games I've played before, this is actually the first one that I've played quite a bit before, but of course on the Super Nintendo. Playing it on the Sega Genesis was both familiar to what I experienced, yet there were parts of it that felt quite unique. I won't get into a great amount of in-depth detail of what exactly is different between both versions. I'll throw some links to sources that have these in the description below. This video instead is here to detail my own personal experience as someone who's grown up with the Nintendo systems, yet playing the Sega Genesis version for the first time. Earthworm Jim was released for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis back in October 1994. There was a Sega CD version released in May 1995. Since I played the straight Genesis port of this on the NSO expansion pack on the Switch, I can't speak to this Sega CD version. There's also been a number of ports to systems like the Game Boy, Game Gear, Windows 95, and Game Boy Advance, as well as a full HD remake released back in 2009. The game stars a normal earthworm, named Jim, who discovers a super suit that fell out of the sky, allowing him to operate it like a normal body, with he himself acting as its head. Beyond this, there's no real plot determined by the game itself, beyond of course the hilarious ending. As we grew up with Nintendo systems, my brother and I heard of this and rented it for a Super Nintendo. Being kids, we of course laughed at some of the fart humor that was in the game, and also being kids, we persisted in a surprisingly difficult variety of levels to work and beat the game. As I've gotten older, I was surprised to hear from others just how difficult this game was. I just thought this was par for the course for video games at the time. This was normal for my brother and I, as we would pat ourselves on our backs often for beating games like Ninja Gaiden and Battletoads. But, make no mistake, Earthworm Jim is quite difficult, and a lot of what I've heard from others confirms this. One of the games that are comparable on a Nintendo system to this would be Soul Blazer on the SNES, in that the player also has... no, come on. Obviously the biggest comparison would be the SNES version of Earthworm Jim, because it is the same game, with some various tweaks here and there. Overall, I've found the SNES version is a slightly smaller resolution, although it's more colorful and the music sounds so much better. The Genesis version has an additional level between For Pete's Sake and the last level, which honestly just kind of felt like it was an unnecessary addition that really didn't belong there. It gave me strong Earthworm Jim 2 vibes too. It was funny though, getting thrown off seeing this extra level I'd never seen before. The Genesis version feels just a hair-breadth tighter on the action and controls aspect, with voice sound effects triggering a fair bit more. The gameplay is split between standard platforming levels and others requiring the player to master some odd or interesting aspects unique to said level. For example, the third level, Down the Tubes, requires the player to use glass contraptions to travel between various underwater habitats. This can grow frustrating, as this contraption, if it touches any of the sides outside, it damages ever so slightly. Take too many hits, and the contraption breaks and the player loses a life. If the player takes too long piloting this contraption, a timer runs out and the player loses a life. The platforming sections in many of the levels can be difficult too, requiring timed jumps, use of Jim himself as a whip-like weapon to swing himself via hooks to other parts of the stage. There's also a couple sections where Jim must use his head to slow his descent to reach safely to the bottom. None more than the last stage is this more present. This is one of the hardest parts of the game, though the most rewarding if beaten successfully. Another gameplay aspect is Level 4's Snot a Problem, where Jim must beat Major Mucus in 3 rounds by making his snot bungee cord break. This is fun at first, though the third and hardest round can get frustrating pretty quick. Level 6 has standard platforming, but where Jim must guide Pete the puppy to his home. If Pete gets injured or falls off, he transforms in a rage and attacks poor Jim. Out of all the levels with something novel in it, I enjoyed the Pete's Sake level the most. That's not to say there weren't parts of this that got annoying. There was, but I had the most fun versus levels with the glass contraptions or the bungee breaking. Perhaps that was because Jim controlled in Pete's Sake like his standard platforming self, which is pretty well. The C button jumps, B uses Jim as a whip, and A shoots his blaster. While he can't fire the gun while moving or jumping in the air, he can at least use his head as a whip while in the air. He can also climb up on ledges. This is done automatically, and he can't just hang there. The glass contraption and Jim on a bungee don't control as smoothly as I've found, making these stages frustrating. Whenever a level is completed, Jim is required to play an Andy Asteroids level that sees Jim heading to his next destination, all the while being raced there by Psychro, the original owner of his supersuit. If Jim loses the race, he must land and fight Psychro on the ground until he runs off. Because health does not regenerate between levels, these fights can often be a drain on the health, and thus a risk to lose a life either in the battle itself or in the next level that Jim will start. This is because health does not regenerate in any way once starting a new level. Keys to victory in Andy Asteroids include picking up the blue bubbles called fuel pods. If Jim collects all 50, he earns a continue. Picking up the asteroid shield to protect Jim from asteroids for a very short time when deployed with a push of a button, and the atomic accelerator, which sees Jim zoom forward very quickly for a short time. Overall, these are a fun diversion from the main game. And Earthworm Jim itself looks pretty great. Graphically, as mentioned before, I felt the Super Nintendo version's a fair bit more colorful, and admittedly I prefer how that game looks. Regardless, the Genesis version is still no slouch, as it, of course, is a 16-bit system as well. Looks good with the many environments, and Jim also is quite expressive in the many sprites that are shown, from firing his gun, to wolf whistling at Princess What's-Her-Name, to whipping himself to defeat bad guys. Many of the bad guys themselves, from as banal as a common enemy encountered numerous times through a stage, to the bosses that appear, are both cartoonish and expressive. Many of these in the third stage are reminiscent of muscular dogs and cats seen in Looney Tunes and Tex Avery cartoons. Being released in 1994, this game was released nearing the end of the Sega Genesis American life cycle. I've found, though, that games released near said respective consoles' life cycles can result in some of the most impressive feats. At least that was the case around this time for gaming. The music and sound were done by Tommy Tallarico and Mark Steven Miller. So, in the gaming world, there's a bit of dispute regarding Tallarico and the promised release of the Intellivision Amico. I'm going to just sidestep that steaming pile of controversy and just focus on the music and just this game. I still stand by my statement earlier that between the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, the Super Nintendo one has the superior sounding soundtrack. Now, that doesn't negate the fact the soundtrack itself is quite excellent, and it still sounds pretty good on the Genesis, too. I did notice the music itself seemed a bit quieter on the Genesis versus the Super Nintendo, especially in levels like It's Not a Problem. The sound effects sound crisper on the Genesis, with the voice samples being more present in this version, too. This lends the gameplay aspect being a bit better on the Genesis, as the sounds match everything quite well. Guns firing, farts exploding, and Jim's southern accent all sound fantastic on the Genesis. Overall, I'd give the Sega Genesis version of Earthworm Jim 7.5 out of 10 Super Nintendo controllers. This is the same exact rating I'd probably give the Super Nintendo version. While there are differences between both of them, they roughly even out to about the same ranking. The game itself has a great feeling gameplay with fun and sometimes tough platforming, funny sounding sound effects and voices, and an absolutely fantastic musical soundtrack. The difficulty itself is probably the biggest issue with the game. Sometimes the levels and or their own unique challenges are tough, while at other times their gameplay elements lend themselves to frustration. The latter occurs, such as the glass contraption running out of time, so it's like so close to the end of that segment, Major Mucus being a butthead and easily breaking through Jim's bungee, Pete continually getting ensnared by plant beasts, Jim keeping on grabbing ledges instead of falling to advance the stage. Yeah, I got annoyed a number of times. But more often than not, I was having fun, and I'd recommend you check this out on the Nintendo Switch's NSO expansion pack. This is also available on PC, Steam as well. Have you played Earthworm Jim either on the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, or another version? Let me know what you think about this game in the comments section below. If you liked my review, please like, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.